Hello, well, very happy to welcome you to SIGDIAL 2020. I'm Yunong Vivian Chen from National Taiwan University under the Department of Computer Science and Information Engineering. I am one of the program co-chairs.
And I'm Smaranda Mureshan, a research scientist at the Data Science Institute at Columbia University, and I am the other program chair. And we welcome you at the 21st annual SIGDIAL meeting on Discourse and Dialogue. And while unfortunately we cannot all be there in the beautiful Boise, Idaho, we welcome you to our first virtual edition of SIGDIAL. We have a large number of participants, the largest to date, over 900 registered participants. And as you can see, more than 500 mentioned they can only participate because SIGDIAL is run virtually. So we have a lot of newcomers to our conference. And we hope that everyone, including students and researchers from academia and industry, will have a productive and engaging meetings around cutting-edge research in discourse and dialogue.
And we want to give the big thanks to our sponsors, including Apple, Russia Technologies, Toshiba Research, Euro, and Honda Research Institute, thanks to their support to our conference. And definitely we want to thank SIGDIAL 2020 organizers, including Olivia as General Chair, and another program co-chair, Samantha, and also Cassie for local virtual chair. He put a lot of effort to run this virtual conference successfully. And David for sponsorship, Nina for mentoring, Stefan for publication, Koji and Eric for video presentations. Also, we want to thank SIGDIAL officers for their suggestion and support to this year's conference. Gabriel, Mikhail, Vikram, Ethan, Jason, and Amanda. This year, we have 8 senior PC members, including Dilip, Annie, Mikhail, Rebecca, Gabriel, Manfred, David, Koigio. Thanks for their support to helping the reviewing process. And also, we want to thank more than 100 PC members for helping the review. Senior Program Chair handled 10 to 15 papers and also led the discussion among reviewers and tried to write the meta review for the papers. Most PC members review 3 to 4 papers for the conference. In the publication, Nina provided a mentoring service and also 1 paper received the mentoring service. During the conference, we also provide the mentoring service thanks the mentors Barbara, Christina, Philip, and Jason. This year, we're happy to receive 104 submissions, including 62 long papers, 32 short papers, and also 10 demo papers. Finally, we decided to accept 33 papers, reaching 33% of accepted rate, including 23 long papers and 10 short papers. Additionally, we have 8 demo papers. This is the statistic of the submissions by country. You can see that most of submissions come from United States, but we also have a lot of submissions from other countries, including Japan, Germany, France, India, China, Italy, Canada, Sweden, and the UK. Also, we have additional 6 countries with 1 submission. This is the statistic for the accepted paper. You can see very similar trend with the submissions. We also have half of paper come from United States, but totally we have 10 countries with accepted papers showing in this figure.
In running the SIGDIAL virtually, we first want to thank our local and virtual chair, Cassie Cannington, who puts together the entire virtual platform, which is Trello. And this is available only to registered participants, and you're going to find there the entire program as well as the paper and the videos for the keynotes and the paper as well. So please watch the Start Here card, which has instructions and video prepared by Cassie that will help you to navigate the platform. In designing the program, Vivian and I thought to keep the spirit of SIGDIAL conference by organizing thematic sessions, a single track, but also mindful of speaker time zones. The keynotes, the talks, and the demo have pre-recorded videos available via Trello and hosted on YouTube and live stream during the conference. Each session will end with a live question answering with speakers via Zoom and stream on YouTube. We welcome you to join the Zoom to ask questions to our speakers. Otherwise, please watch them on streaming on YouTube. We also have breakout discussions that were going to be live and led by discussion leaders. And our closing meeting, which includes the business meeting as well as the best paper ceremony, will be live via Zoom and stream on YouTube. Some of the program highlights: we have 3 keynote speakers. Gabriel Scanze from HGH Royal Institute of Technology on conversational turn-taking in human-robot interaction. Asli Çelikilmaz from Microsoft Research on neural text generation progress and challenges, and Diana Littman from University of Pittsburgh on argument mining, discourse analysis, and educational applications. We also have a special session on situated dialogue with virtual agents and robots, and we want to thank Jose, Stephanie, Matthew, Vikram, Matthias, Cassie, and Cynthia for organizing this special session, which will take place on the first day of the conference. Also part of our program, we have breakout discussions, which are participant-led sessions around certain topics on discourse and dialogue. And our goal was to allow participants to connect, meet new people, and share knowledge, best practices, and opportunities around areas on discourse and dialogue. We currently have 13 such sessions, and we want to extend our thanks to all discussion leaders who accepted our invitation. And in addition, we want to welcome other participants to spontaneously schedule informal breakout discussion during the conference. And if you'd want to do that on a specific topic, please look at the Start Here instruction from Cassie on how to do that on our Trello platform. The proceedings will be available on our official website on July 1st. And SIGDIAL offers Best Paper Awards. And for this year, our Best Paper nominees are TRIPI, a triple copy strategy for value-independent neural dialogue state tracking. Is your goal-oriented dialogue model performing really well? Empirical analysis of system-wise evaluation. And learning from mistakes, combining ontology via self-training for dialogue generation. Congratulations to all the authors, and the Best Paper Award will be chosen and presented at the closing ceremony. And now we're going to start our program with our first keynote speaker, Gabriel, who is a professor at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology and the president of SIGDIAL. And he's going to talk about conversational turn-taking in human-robot interaction. So again, welcome everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful conference at SIGDIAL in a virtual format.
Welcome to SIGDIAL 2020.
Last thing we want to remind you, if you want to post anything on social media such as Twitter, please use this hashtag so that we can easily find all posts related to SIGDIAL 2020. Then, welcome to our awesome conference.
Hi, Hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me to have this keynote at SIGDIAL 2020. As you can see, the title of my talk is Conversational Turn-Taking in Human-Robot Interaction. So there are sort of two parts to this. I will start talking about human-robot interaction and why I think that should be of interest for people working on dialogue and conversational systems. And then I will shift over to talk about conversational turn-taking and our research there and how that relates to human-robot interaction. So, of course, the idea of interacting with robots is something that has triggered our imagination for a long time. And it has always been clear that the way we interact with these robots is by talking to them. Luke Skywalker wouldn't pick up a remote control here to control C-3PO, but of course they talk to each other. But still today, I would say that the research field of dialogue and speech and natural language processing on the one hand and human-robot interaction and robotics on the other are kind of two separate fields still, which is a bit sad, given this sort of natural match. So if you go to a conference like HRI, there is very little dialogue there actually, and a lot of the studies are done using Wizard of Oz. And on the other hand, of course, if you go to an NLP conference or even SIGDIAL, there is very little human-robot interaction. I'm very glad that we have a special session on human-robot dialogue this year, but often there are not so many papers on that area. So that's something I would like to sort of promote in this talk. So if we step away a bit from science fiction and look at robots in real life, this is of course the way robots have been looking and working in factories, for example, assembling cars like this. And it's clear that these are sort of dangerous, dull machines that you shouldn't be near. They are not social robots. So what's happening now is that a lot of people are now working on what we call social robots, which means that there's robots that are actually interacting with humans in different ways, as you see here. So in healthcare, for example, there's this robot that helps people to go to the bathroom by lifting them. You cannot talk to this robot yet, which you would like to do probably to instruct it on what to do and not to do and so on. And the same goes for the picture below in small-scale manufacturing, where we are programming this robot by grabbing the arm and showing it sort of the instructions. And again, you typically can't talk to these kind of robots, which you obviously would like to do. You would like to use dialogue and spoken interaction to do the instruction. On the right side, we can see robots who have sort of a social purpose. They don't do any physical task. So in the upper right image, for example, we see the Pepper robot, which actually has arms, but the arms are not there to do any sort of physical task. They are for social purposes. So you can, for example, do gesticulation and pointing and so on. And below that, we see the Fur Hat robot that I have been part of developing, and that I will talk more about later on here. And as you can see, actually, it's only a head even. So if the robot then is just a head, or it's purely social function, then you could ask, of course, yourself, why would you need a robot? Why not just talk to my smartphone or a smart speaker, for example, using my voice? It's a good question, but one way of answering it is by comparing with interaction with humans. So why would you ever meet someone in person when you could equally well just call them on the phone? And I think especially these days, we have sort of learned to appreciate physical meetings with people. And there are many reasons for this. One is, of course, the face that we will come back to. But you can see the face of other people in a Skype conversation, for example. And still, we think that a physical meeting is much better, especially if it's a multi-party meeting with several people interacting. And the reason, of course, is that you can very easily and very quickly see who is addressing whom, are people attending, someone falling asleep, what are the facial expressions and reactions and so on, in a way that you can't do in other types of settings. You can also have objects on the table that you point to and so on. And you can see the analogy to the picture above there with the robot and 2 people and a table with objects on the table. So let's talk a bit more about the face and why the face is important for conversation. You can see this from both in sort of an output perspective and an input perspective from the system side. So as from the output perspective, if the system or the machine has a face, the user can very quickly see the attention of the agent. Where is the agent attending? Whom is it attending? You can quickly read the facial expressions. Does it look surprised or puzzled or happy, and so on. And also you can see the lip movements, and that actually helps in speech comprehension, not just for hearing impaired people, but people in general can benefit from this, of course, especially in noisy situations. From an input perspective, if the system has a camera and can see faces of people, you can, of course, see, is there anyone to interact with? So my Google Home device at home cannot see me, it doesn't know that I'm there, and cannot sort of initiate an interaction with me. But if you can see the faces, you can detect how many are there. Does it look like they're interested in talking to the system? You can recognize them much easier, of course. If you can see the faces, you can also read their facial expressions. And you can also infer their attention. So are the people attending to each other, to objects in the environment, or they are attending to the robot? And that helps a lot in, for example, turn taking, that we will come back to later on. So given that we know that the face is very important, what are the different options for giving the machine a face? A very common approach in robotics is to have the kind of face that you see in the Now robot here, which is actually very unexpressive. You cannot read any lip movements, you cannot read any facial expressions. You have some kind of gaze direction, but not decoupled from the head movements. Then there are more abstract things like the Jibo robot here. And of course, that can be very expressive also, but an argument for having a more human-like robot is that we already know how to interpret those kind of social signals, and we can directly start to understand what the signals that the robots are using. And then we have things like robots like Sophia here, which is very human-like when you look at an image like this, so potentially extremely expressive. The problem is partly that it's very expensive, of course, with a lot of motors. But also when it starts to move, it's very hard to match this kind of extremely human-like appearance with extremely human-like motions using this technique. So it can give sort of an uncanny valley effect when this mismatch occur. Then you have, of course, animated agents on displays that you can see here also. They can be very expressive, have facial expressions and so on. And people don't find them uncanny often, but there you can end up in a situation if you have several people, it can be hard to know where the agent is looking. It's a little bit like a Skype conversation again. So if the agent is looking straight into the camera, everyone will think that the agent is looking at them, just like a newsreader. And you cannot really establish sort of exclusive mutual gaze with one of the participant, which is needed for multi-party interaction. So we tried to address this problem when we developed the fur hat robot at KTH about 10 years ago. So we took the animated agent that we had been working in our conversational systems, and we projected it, back projected it on a mask, as you can see here. And to cover it all up, we put a fur hat that was lying around on it. And here you actually can have then this kind of very expressive facial animation combined with exclusive mutual gaze and the presence in the room. And a lot of people were interested in this, so wanted to buy one. We were just researchers, but then after some time we figured out we should actually start a company called Furhat Robotics. And here you can see the latest version of the robot. And it doesn't have a fur hat in that picture. You can have a fur hat, but you can actually have any headgear that you want, a wig or so on. So one of the advantages of this technology is actually that you can make the robot look in any way you want, because you can change the animation, you can even change the mask and so on. So if you want to have it more human-like or less human-like, or if you prefer a female or a male character and so on, you can do that very easily. So we've had a lot of collaborations and trying it out in different commercial settings. This is one example, collaboration with Deutsche Bahn, a robot called Semi, that has been working in Tokyo train station, Berlin train station that you can see here, and Frankfurt airport, helping people with questions like, is my train delayed? Where can I buy a newspaper? Where is the bathroom? And one of the advantages here is you can very easily switch language, because you have a lot of people speak different languages. This one is German and English and Spanish, for example. And since it's physically situated, you can have the robot look in the direction that it's talking about and so on. This is another example. This is a collaboration with a company called TNG in Stockholm, a recruitment company, which has developed a robot called Tengai that performs job interviews. So the idea here is that regular job interviews are sort of plagued by bias, because as humans we very quickly form an idea about the person we are talking to. So that idea will not only affect the assessment of that candidate, but it will also affect how the interview is actually done and how we talk to this person, which in turn then affects how the candidate replies to the answers. So the idea is to create a setting which is very similar to a human-to-human interview, but having a robot that performs it in exactly the same way with every candidate. So we also have a lot of researchers using Furhat in their research on human-robot interaction. And this is an example of Robert Johansson that is using Furhat to build a simulation environment for people to train to become a psychotherapist, and the robot then acts as a virtual patient. And you can see what it looks like here.
Hi there.
Hi there.
So, what problem can I help you with today?
Well, I don't recognize myself lately.
Can you be more specific?
Yeah.
Could you please be more specific?
Maybe there are some problems at work.
That's a bit vague.
Sure.
What happens at work that becomes a problem for you?
I get into lots of conflicts.
So as you can see here in this video, having this kind of human-like face in this setting is clearly very important, and because you should be able to train to read the expressions of the patient and so on. So as I said before, one of the advantages of having a physical robot is that it allows for situated interaction, and by that we also mean multi-party interaction, which means that you can have several people talking to the robot. This is a setting we have been using quite a lot. It's a game where you have two people playing a game together with the robot, and in this game you're supposed to sort a set of cards according to some criterion. In this case we see here it's buildings in Stockholm. You should sort them on according to how tall the buildings are. And the robot here is actually programmed to be more like a peer than a tutor. So the robot can actually be wrong, and you're supposed to talk to the robot as you are talking to the person sitting next to you, actually. And to model this, we use what we call a situation model. So we take all the sensory input and we put that together into a reconstruction of what's happening here. You can see it's like a 3D model, but seen from the above, where we can see where Furhat is located. We can see here, and we can see that the user are located. We can see their direction of their head pose to get some idea of where they are looking, their attention. And we can see the table and the objects of the table. And this, of course, helps to be able to make Furhat look in the right direction when looking at the cards or looking at the persons in order to get mutual gaze and so on. And to figure out who is actually speaking now and who is addressing whom and so on. in order to drive the sort of behavior of the robot. Okay, so let's see an interaction with Furhat in this setting. As you can see, we can see the situation model that we talked about over here. We can see Furhat over here and the camera feed of Furhat over here. And the interaction is in Swedish, but it's subtitled in English. And you can perhaps especially pay attention to the turn taking. When does Furhat take the turn, and when does he not take the turn? So let's see.
Jag har hört att Italien har många guld i fäktning och cykling.
Ja, men de är väl ganska bra, är de inte det? Kanske ska ligga med här borta. Kanske.
Ja, jag vet inte.
Danmark vet jag inte
Danmark,
hur bra de är.
kanske med vintersport, men alla andra länder, Portugal, Italien, de är inte så bra med vintersport.
Nej.
Grekland.
Men Finland har väl mycket? Är inte Finland bra på vintersport? Vad tror du?
Finland har ju mycket snö, så de borde vara bra på vintersport.
Ja, jag tycker också det. Vi lägger dem ganska högt här borta. Men kanske inte lika högt som Italien. Danmark kanske.
Jag tycker också att det verkar bättre att ha Finland där.
Ja, det tycker jag också.
So as you could see, this was sort of a very free form conversation. It's not like we are giving commands to Furhat or just asking questions, but it's kind of a spontaneous conversation, which makes it very interesting from a turn-taking perspective, because it means that Furhat has to figure out when to speak and when to not speak, and when there is an opportunity to take the turn, and when is Furhat directly addressed, and so on. And we actually had this at a display at the Technical Museum in Stockholm over a week, and we managed to record a lot of interactions, around 400 interactions, with very diverse population of combinations of different ages and gender and so on, which was very nice. And we did a series of experiments and also analysis of the data that we collected. So let's talk a bit more about turn taking and the research we have done in that area. So this is of course a topic that has been studied a lot in linguistics and phonetics and so on. And the interesting thing is that people are very good at coordinating their turn taking with each other. So what you can do, for example, is to create a histogram like this of the gap between turns in a corpus. And you can see here that the modal response time is around 200 milliseconds. So that's of course extremely fast response time. The negative times here are of course overlap, so that can happen also, and longer gaps can happen also, but often the turn taking is very quick. And the only way of sort of explaining this is that there has to be coordination mechanism going on. There has to be some kind of cues or signals being exchanged, and people, as we will see, also have to predict what is supposedly happening next. So looking at these coordination signals, what researchers often do is to talk about these so-called TRPs, or transition relevant places. And when someone is speaking and the next person starts to speak, they often try to identify these kind of transition relevant places where I can take the turn. It doesn't have to mean that you have to take the turn, but it's a place where it's possible to take the turn. What also happens, of course, is that people make pauses within a turn where the other person is not supposed to take the turn. So that is sort of a non-TRP. And this sort of then involves some kind of turn holding signals or cues, and some kind of turn yielding signals or cues that people have been studying. So this is what you find, that these can be found across different modalities. So for example, syntax, a more complete syntax is a turn-yielding cue, whereas a more incomplete turn-holding. Prosodically, you might yield a turn with a rising or falling pitch, lower intensity, shorter duration. Breathing, if I breathe in, I'm likely gonna say something more. If I breathe out, I might be finished. Gaze, we typically look away during our turn and then look up at the addressee at the end of the turn. Gestures might be sort of non-terminated if I make a pause, or more terminated if I'm yielding the turn. And what you find typically is that the more of these cues are combined, the stronger, of course, the cue is for the other person to understand whether the speaker is holding or yielding the turn. So these cues can then be used by the robot for coordinating its turn-taking with the user, either by detecting these cues in the user's signaling, or using the cues by the robot in order to signal its sort of turn-taking intentions. So this is an example from the card game that we saw before, an experiment we did while running the system live with users. So we experimented with different turn-holding cues. And the reason for this was that we had a bit of a response delay in the system due to a cloud-based recognizer. So for example, when the user asked the robot, what do you think? And the robot came up with an answer, I think the tiger is faster. It took about 1200 or 1300 milliseconds for it to come up with this answer, even though it has sort of already understood that the user's utterance was sort of finished. And the risk with this kind of response delay is that the user doesn't understand that the robot is about to answer. So the user might say something like, hello, or say something else. And that might very well happen just as the robot is about to speak, and you get this kind of conflict and turn-taking problems. So one way of avoiding this problem is, of course, to, before you know exactly what to say, you can produce a turn-holding cue that sort of shows that, hey, I understood that you asked me something, I just need to think a bit about the answer. This can be done in different ways, and we experimented with different combinations of cues there to see their effect. So gaze, for example, what you should do if you want to hold the turn is to keep to sort of gaze away at that point. But to study the effect, of course, we compare that with keeping the gaze towards the user. We could also combine this with different verbal or facial cues. For example, a filled pause is often used for this. We used an in-breath, like a smile, which is perhaps not a sort of obvious turn-taking cue, but it's a signal that I'm sort of processing what you're saying. And also, of course, as a baseline, again, doing nothing of this. So if we do nothing and we keep the gaze, we would expect this to have no sort of inhibiting effect. And we can measure the effect of these cues by looking at the probability of the user saying something here. So if we have a very effective turn-holding cue, the probability should be low for the user to say something there. Whereas if we have a non-effective cue, then we should sort of see a high probability here. And here is the results. And you can see that if we keep gaze, which are the light blue bars here, and we do no expression, just like we expected, we find an almost 35% probability that the user will actually start speaking again, which creates problems. But if we, in general, if we gaze away, you see the dark blue bars are lower. If we combine it with like a filled pause or a smile, we can reduce this probability by more than half. So these cues are very effective. And remember that this is not something we told the users, that, hey, the robots are using these cues in order so that you will know when it will speak and not. It's just something that people sort of more naturally read from a human-like face. So then if we look at multi-party dialogue, it's not just about yielding or holding the turn, it's also about who are you yielding the turn to. And that can be done in different ways, but obviously gaze is very important there. And you can talk about self-selection or other selection. In self-selection, it's up to the next speaker to decide to some extent. And this can be done with FurHat if you're, for example, looking at both users, as in this picture here, both users, it's clear that the robot is yielding the turn, but any user can choose to speak next. If the robot looks at the cards, for example, and says something, it's not so clear who should speak next. It's again up to self-selection. It could even be the robot that continues to speak. But then you have other selection, which is shown here, is when you actively gaze at one person, for example, ask a question, and it's very clear who's supposed to speak next. So this sort of creates different mechanisms for handing over the turn. And we were interested in how this could be used to shape the participation in quality in multi-party dialogue. And if you look at the data set, you can calculate for each dialogue an imbalance score that you can see the formula here, which is 1 minus the speaking time of the one that speaks least divided by the speaking time of the one that speaks most, which means that 0 is perfect balance, 1 is one person speaks all the time, 0.5, one person speaks twice as much. And in fact, in the data set, most interactions were imbalanced. We had an average imbalance score of 0.4. And then you could think that there are two explanations of this. One is that the dominant user produces longer utterances, or that the dominant user takes the turn more often when there is an opportunity for that, or a combination of these, of course. So what does the data say? Overall speaking time imbalance, as we saw, was 0.4. The overall turn-taking imbalance, if we, instead of speaking time, calculate the number of time you take the turn when there is an opportunity, we get a number that is very close to this. So it means that it's not so much about producing longer utterances, but to a large extent about who actually takes the turn. And it means that if the robot has an influence on who speaks next, the robot should be able to reduce this imbalance by actively selecting the next speaker. So what is the effect of these different strategies then? We can see here that if we have this kind of self-selection where the robot is yielding the turn but looking at both people, it's not so much of a difference between the dominant and the non-dominant speaker compared to when the robot is just looking at the cards and saying something, and it's even more sort of optional to speak next. Then we see a much bigger difference in who is to speak next. Of course, if we select the dominant speaker actively, the difference is, of course, very big. But we can shift this difference a bit if we select the non-dominant speaker. And then you can see that the sort of balance shifts over. So clearly the robot can have an influence on this participation equality. Then we were interested in looking at how does this imbalance look if we look at different demographics. As I mentioned, in this data set, we have a lot of different combinations of age and gender. This graph shows the used speaking time of all the available time, and you can see that one group stands out here. It's adult females, and you should read the graph as 0.3. It means that they use about 30% of the available time for speaking. And the gray area shows overlap here. You can see it's quite a big overlap. This is not like competitive overlap where you're interrupting each other. It's more like back channels and supportive speech. And there's, for example, a big difference if you compare to adult males that you can see here. And also adult male and adult female, which is quite close to adult males. Also, interesting enough, there is no sort of real clear imbalance between adult males and adult females. And the same goes for child female, child male. So no clear gender difference here in the terms of imbalance, but there is a clear age difference. So if you look at two child females and compare how much this child female talks with another child female compared to with an adult, then it's a clear difference. So in general, children paired with another child speaks much more than when paired with an adult, where it seems like the adult to some extent is a little bit taking over the interaction. So now we have talked about how the robot can yield a turn in different ways and how it can use turn-taking cues for this. And I want to shift over to how the robot can detect turn-taking cues from the user in order to know when the user is yielding the turn and not. And sort of the traditional dialogue system model, the simplest possible, is what we could call a silence-based model, which means that we are looking for a certain amount of silence in the user's speech, in this case 700 milliseconds, and we sort of just think that that is a transition relevance place, and the robot takes the turn, or the system takes the turn. This is problematic because it means that since people make longer pauses, the system will interrupt the user every now and then. We can of course increase this silence threshold, but then we will get more sluggish responses instead. So one approach is to use what we call an IPU-based model, which means that we use a much shorter threshold, like 200 milliseconds, and then we start processing transition relevance place cues or turn yielding or turn holding cues in the user's speech or other kind of signals to decide whether the system should take the turn or not. So can we apply this to this setting? And remember that this setting it's not just someone asking a question, it's an open conversation. So here's an example. Someone might say, yeah, and that is probably then a place where you shouldn't take the turn. This is probably turn holding cue. But if they say like this, and then look in at the table, we could call this an opportunity to take the turn. You could take the turn, but you don't have to. It could be the other person who should take the turn, or maybe the person will continue. But if someone says, what do you think, and looks up at Furhat, it's sort of a clear turn yielding signal to Furhat. So in this case, Furhat, we could say, have an obligation to take the turn. So rather than just sort of treating this as a binary problem of not taking or taking the turn, we tried in this case to treat it as a more continuous scale from absolutely don't to you have an obligation to take the turn. And note also that this sort of combines this end of turn prediction with addressy detection. So it's also about figuring out whether it's actually Furhat that is supposed to. It could be a strong turn yielding cue, but to the other person. So we are sort of baking these two problems together. And what we did was to look at the data and find IPUs and then annotate them using this schema on this continuous scale. And then we used a simple supervised learning, simple neural network to see if we can take all the multimodal data we have and try to predict these labels. What we found was that actually each of these different cues, we had the head pose, we had the prosody from the speakers, we had the words, we had the card movements, we had the dialogue history, which was what did the robot say before this. All of them were kind of okay predictors for turn taking. Head pose, for example, here we got a F-score of 0.7. But what we found was that if you combine these cues, then of course, if you add prosody, you get a better F-score, 0.79. And if you add everything, 0.85, you get even better. So it sort of confirms the finding in the literature that when you combine a lot of different multimodal cues, you can get a more robust idea of when to take the turn and not. So what we saw here was an approach that clearly is better than the silence-based models because we are using these cues to find better places to take the turn. But if we look at human-human interaction, it's clear that this is sort of not enough. Humans don't only react to these cues, they also do predictions in dialogue. And that's very clear when we look at the data. So this is from the map task. And you can see that the first person says the start, have you got an extinct volcano? And the other person says, yeah, it's just at the top of it. And you can see that this turn starts even before this other turn was complete. So clearly, this person has to predict what is going to happen, perhaps already at T0, given sort of cognitive and articulation constraints and so on, to predict that soon this will end. What is the likely way it will end? It's a volcano, in order to actually come up with the response that I actually have a volcano on my map. Similar at this point, the person has to make a pause. Okay, you go, and then that person probably predicts that the other person, given that the pause is long enough, has a risk of taking the turn. So I have to sort of inhibit that by producing this filled pause. So this kind of predictions of how the other person is going to react and what they will say and so on is likely occurring sort of all the time here. So this means that we should probably go, of course, beyond the silence-based model to the IPU to a more continuous model where we are continuously predicting, is there a transition relevance place? Maybe there is a back channel relevance place because back channels are often produced in overlap, or even projections about what will happen next, so I can start preparing my response and so on. So we proposed a model, first step for a model for actually doing this, and the approach we used was to slice up the speech of the two persons. This is again, we used the map task data. We sliced up the speech from the two persons in frames of about 50 milliseconds or 20 frames per second. And then we feed them into an LSTM. We use prosodic, acoustic features, as well as word information if we have that. And then at each frame we make a prediction for the next 3 seconds of every frame in the next 3 seconds. How likely is it that the person will speak and not in that frame? And we can of course train this then in a self-supervised fashion by actually feeding it the binary sort of voice activity labels of that future. So we can feed it with a lot of data and train the model to make these kind of continuous predictions. So let's see what happens when we apply this model to unseen data. As you can see in the video here, we are currently at the red line. And you can see the actual future, what happens in the video here in the next 3 seconds, and the green line show the predicted future. So the higher the line goes, the higher is the probability that the person will speak, and the lower it goes, the lower the probability, and you can see one prediction for each speaker here and compare them. And I will play the video. It goes a bit fast, but I will slow it down afterwards for you.
The start, have you got an extinct volcano?
Yeah, it's just at the top of it.
Right, okay. You go down the left-hand side of the extinct volcano till you're about 1 centimetre below it, and then you go along the bottom of the page. Have you got a tribal settlement?
Right.
So let's look at this in slow motion then. And as you can see here, the predictions are really updated for every frame that we go through. So it's really a continuous model in that sense. And this is because the LSTM gets new information all the time and produce new predictions. Even when we go through a silence, we get updated predictions for every frame, which is because the longer the silence, the more likely it is that some participant will actually start to speak. So if we freeze the prediction at certain points in time, we can see more closely what the model is doing. And one thing you can do is, of course, to apply it to this kind of endpoint detection. So just after someone has stopped speaking, we can see what the prediction looks like. And you can see here that in this case, when this person has stopped speaking, it makes a prediction that this person is likely not speaking very soon, but it's a higher probability that this person will speak next. So it actually makes a good prediction of who will be the next speaker. And it also, as you see, predicts that this will not be a very long utterance as the probability goes down here. Contrasted to this case where we can see that when this person has stopped speaking, it's quite a high probability that the person will continue, whereas it's a low probability that the other person will continue. And we can also apply it for other tasks, since it's a general model, so we can look at the speech onset to see sort of how long will this utterance be. So for this, in this case, we see that the probability that the person will continue speaking drops quite a lot here, which means that we are predicting a short utterance, and in this case it drops less, so it's probably a longer utterance. And this can be very useful in a dialogue system. If the user starts speaking, you want to know, is perhaps just a short back channel, maybe I can continue speaking, or is it supposed to be a longer utterance and I should sort of let the user talk here. So if we go back to the prediction at pauses that we looked at before, we can actually evaluate the model, because we can ask the model who's the next speaker, and we can see is the prediction correct. We can calculate an F-score to see that. So more like an sort of IPU-based model, the way you would sort of evaluate that. And of course, the majority class baseline, which is to guess that the same person will continue speaking, is not very good. And if we apply our model, we get better performance, as you can see here. If we use all feature, which means that we also use not just the prosodic features, but also the words that are being fed into the LSTM, we get slightly higher score. Still, it's hard to know, is this a good score or not? What should we compare with? You can't really expect to have 100%, because turn taking is to a large extent optional. So even if you have a TRP, it doesn't mean that you have to take the turn. You still have sort of the choice of taking the turn or not. One thing we can do is to compare it with human performance. So we gave the same task to humans to predict who's the next speaker. And as you can see here, the model performs slightly better than humans. We then followed this up and looked more closely how we can actually tune these different speech parameters and linguistic parameters and so on, and got an even higher score here, as you can see. Another thing we did was to look at a multi-scale RNN approach, where you have different sub-networks that process acoustic features and linguistic features. And the reason for that is, of course, that acoustic features occur at a much higher frequency compared to linguistic features, which are words. And this makes it easier for the LSTM to backpropagate through this. And then we sort of combine these in a master LSTM. And as you can see down here, if we do that, we get an even better score. So we are approaching the end, and just to reflect a bit on what are we still missing here. And of course, we want to use these prediction models in a live conversational system. And we think that using these models, the system should be able to for people working on discourse modeling. This should be interesting. So to conclude, turn taking in dialogue is a coordination problem. It benefits from multiple modalities: coordination using linguistic cues, prosody, gaze, and so on. And the face acts as a very important coordination device, which helps to explain why we like face-to-face interaction over telephone conversation. And if it's a multi-party interaction, a physically situated interaction, which you can have with a robot, clearly facilitates that kind of interaction. And current conversational systems lack understanding of coordination signals and generation coordination signals. So that's something that we have to work more on, of course. And also that real-time coordination cannot be fully achieved without making predictions about the future. So models of prediction can be learned in a self-supervised fashion on dialogue data, we think. So that concludes my talk, and thank you everyone for listening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for
All right. Thank you, Gabriel. Sorry for the little pause there in audio. I think I figured out what was going on. I wanted to show people how to join the live question answer session. If you go to the Trello board and you click on the Keynote 1 here, QA session and general chair welcome. If you click on that, there's a link to join the Zoom live QA. I see people are starting to do that. So please start doing that, and I will turn the time over now to Olivier to, I guess, take over from here.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I just wanted to welcome you to this very special edition of SIGDIAL, the SIGDIAL conference. So I'm Olivier Pietquin. I'm from Google Research, and I serve as a general chair for this edition. Of course, it was not expected that we would be doing that remotely and virtually. I wish we were all together in beautiful Boise and enjoying the great organization that Casey prepared. I can tell you that he really did a good job before knowing that this edition would be virtual. He already prepared everything so that we had exceptional and great experience in Boise. And unfortunately, this will not happen, but I want to thank him a lot. I want to take this opportunity to thank Casey, to all local organization chair, for switching from local organization to virtual organization. That Casey prepared. I can tell you that he really did a good job before knowing that this edition would be virtual. He already prepared everything so that we had exceptional and great experience in Boise. And unfortunately, this will not happen. But I want to thank him a lot. I want to take the. Yeah, sorry, I was hearing him back. Yeah, so I wanted to say that switching from local organization to virtual organization was seamless thanks to Casey, and he also did a great job making this experience very special, because the organization is very original, using a combination of Trello, Zoom, and YouTube is, I think, very, very good idea, and it all comes from him. So thank you very much, Casey, for doing that. That being said, I hope that you will enjoy this exceptional program that we have this year, with 3 keynotes and many, many very good talks, and 3 nominees for these papers that will be announced on Friday. I also want to thank the whole program committee and the whole organization committee of this edition of SIGDIAL. I want to thank Miranda, Vivian, Stefan, Nina, David, Koji, Eric, and also Alice and Guillaume, and also a special thank to the SIGDIAL exec board, who was very, very supportive during the whole organization. I wanted also to highlight one thing that is very positive, because we switched to a virtual conference. So because we switched to the virtual conference, we actually could we could actually have much more attendees than usually, with more than 900 people who registered to the conference, and more than half of these people said they wouldn't be able to attend physically anyway. So that means that we can actually reach a lot of more people beyond the community, etc., which is a very nice outcome, and that we should probably take insight from for the next organizations, etc. So that was my welcome message. Thank you everybody for attending the conference. I hope you will enjoy it. I hope you will have a very good SIGDIAL 2020. And now I think we should switch to the Q&A for Gabriel talk. Yeah, so I just remind you that Gabriel is a professor at KTH, teaches speech communication there, co-founder of FURAT, which was the topic of, well, at least he used it for the experiment during the keynote. He's also well known for his work in human-robot interaction, and that's also what's the topic of the keynote, turn-taking in human-robot interaction. So please, if you have questions, just raise your hand and we'll switch to the Q&A. Thank you. Any question?
I have a question.
Nigel? Yeah, I see. Nigel, you have one. Yeah, sorry.
So Gabriel, thank you for the wonderful talk. It's really great work. So the most interesting thing to me happened when I lost the audio at the second to last slide. You talked about limitations to the data sets. And I know that you've had great success because you've had sufficiently large data sets you can train complex models. What do you see as prospects for building models of turn-taking that could be readily adaptable, given just like a half-hour data to a new domain? Is that something that's on the horizon? Do you have any thoughts about how we might get there?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think that is one of the really limiting factors of these models, and why we are not really using them in most of our applications is because you can't train a specific turn-taking model for a specific domain, and the turn-taking patterns can be very different from different applications. So it is very hard to just train on map task, for example, and then apply that to another domain. You will not get very good predictions. So this is really a problem, but it is something that we are looking into, and especially now that what we have started to do is to look more into sort of how can we use the linguistic features even more, because we see that they don't contribute as much as we would expect to the performance, which means that we are probably not modeling the pragmatic and semantic aspects of turn-taking very well, I think. And these are also aspects that I think are perhaps easier to transfer, or at least you can train on very large corpora and find these kind of patterns. I think now it's very hard. We haven't done that much analysis, actually, so we don't know that much about how these predictions that we saw on MapTask here, for example, what they are actually based on. What are the, I mean, we have done a little bit, but not so much. So that's also something we have started to do, to look into the model and open them up and see what is it actually they are using here. There is a risk, of course, that they learn quite superficial patterns in the data of map task, for example, one person speaking, the other giving an acknowledgement and so on, rather than actually learning these sort of more advanced cues. So I think part of the question is to look at the model, see what they are doing, and also making them do more sophisticated modeling. And that I think also has a better chance of transferring to other domains if it's actually a deep understanding of the turn-taking cues rather than these more superficial patterns.
Thank you.
Thank you. David, thank you. Question?
Very nice talk, Gabriel, and appreciate how well you did, even despite the pre-recording and so on. I had another question also about the last part of the talk, and you presented a human baseline to compare your models. And if I understand right, what you did there was have crowdsourced workers that are just giving a small snippet of the prior speech and being asked to make the prediction. So that's in a sense like the untrained or trying to go across domains where they're not necessarily experts in the specific domain. which may be part of the reason why we're seeing lower performance there. And another aspect is that these would be overhearers trying to make the prediction, and we know from many previous studies that overhearers do significantly worse than, let's say, listeners in a conversation, participants in a conversation. So I wonder if you had any thoughts since 2017 about what might be a better human baseline, both for the prediction, offline prediction task that you've done here, and then the idea of being able to use this as part of a dialogue system that would decide when to speak.
Yes, no, I agree. But it's very hard to come up with a meaningful baseline. As you say, there are many aspects there. I guess still these crowd workers got the chance to, since they did many tasks typically, they got the chance to familiarize themselves with the kind of dialogue they were listening to. I don't remember now exactly how many seconds they got to listen to before making the prediction. But after some of these tasks, they perhaps would get an idea about the task. And making the decision as a speaker, of course, is different for many reasons. One is, of course, that the reason in map task, especially, the reason you take the turn is a task-oriented dialogue. So you make an acknowledgement because you have found that volcano on your map. That's why you make the acknowledgement. If you just look at dialogue data, how can you predict that the person will make an acknowledgement if you don't have access to the actual task they are doing? But this is a problem, of course, even for the for the model. So there are many problems here. I'm not sure I can come up with a much better baseline actually than having third-party observers as a sort of a human baseline. And then your last question was about applying them to dialogue systems. So that's also very interesting because, again, these are sort of predictions of what a human, sort of the average human, would do in this situation. It doesn't mean that the system has to do this. So you have to sort of combine it with some kind of agenda from the system to actually speak. So again, you make an acknowledgement because you found the thing on the map and so on. So if you would have to combine this model of, like, is this a good place to make an acknowledgement with, do I want to make an acknowledgement, of course. And these combined would give you an idea of whether to take the turn or not. And as we saw in the robot scenario before also, sometimes there is actually an obligation to take the turn, even if you don't have anything meaningful to say. So if you're sitting playing this card game and someone asks us, what do you think? Even if I don't have anything, any idea about how to solve a problem, I have to say something. So sometimes you have an obligation to take the turn also, even if you don't want to speak. So that's, of course, another aspect that should be incorporated here. And another idea with these models, of course, is that they can work as a user model. So the system, if you have a prediction model, the system could, for example, say that, okay, we are at this point in the dialogue. If I would do this, how is the user likely to react using this model? And then you can actually, for example, you could feed the model with different prosodic realizations of the synthesized speech, and you can see how that could actually affect the user's willingness to take the turn, or sort of likelihood to take the turn. So it's a very interesting also as a user model, I think.
Thank you. I see that Eric has a question.
Yeah, hi, thanks. That was a great talk. I was coming from more, somebody's coming from more the speech recognition side of things. I'm kind of curious to know, I was very interested in like how you were combining the lexical features in that last bit of with the prosodics. And I was wondering, like, what kind of latencies and accuracy would you really need to have like good lexical features to actually interact on, because that seems to me like a significant technical challenge. So I'm kind of curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that is getting better. I mean, we used to have recognizers locally, and I've done work in the past where we had local recognizer just recognizing numbers, and you can get extremely fast response, sort of ASR results even while you are saying the word and so on. Whereas now that it's cloud-based, we got sort of a quite big delay in the actual results. Now actually the cloud-based are starting to give incremental results that are without not that much delay actually. So I think there is definitely a potential there. I guess the problem is, of course, that the most uncertain part of the speech recognition result is likely the last word, because it's very hard to know whether you're in the middle of a word or sort of. So you will get very unstable results there, and it's actually the last words that are. So I think there is. I think someone should mute their microphone. It's actually the last words that are interesting from a turn-taking perspective, not only, but they are quite critical because this syntactic or pragmatic completeness is a very strong turn-taking signal. So definitely that's a challenge that I haven't looked that much into actually. How well that would work.
The thing that struck me was that you were looking at things that are like in the 200 milliseconds. So that's like syllable level, cues that you're looking at. And, I can sort of say like 200 milliseconds would be really hard to, come back with on an ASR. Like, I know it's this word kind of thing. So I think that's an interesting research challenge about thinking about the tighter integration of these cues might be a interesting research direction. So
definitely, and maybe that has been something that in the ASR community you haven't really prioritized this because you haven't seen why would you have to produce these results so quickly and so on. So it's when you put it in a dialogue system that you sort of realize that this timing is actually extremely important.
Thank you. I see that Diane has a question as well.
Hi, Gabriel. Great talk, as everyone said. So I had a question about going back to the beginning of your talk where you were arguing that having a system like Furhat would be better than having it like a virtual agent on a computer. And I was wondering if you could return to that kind of inputs for that model could be all available to a virtual agent, and similarly from kind of the output, how they would, change the turn-taking behavior. Are there things that Furhat can do that just putting it on a terminal screen would not be able to do?
Yeah, I mean, not from the input perspective. Of course, you can have cameras and everything with a virtual agent. So that's not really different. The difference is, of course, the user's perception of the agent. So if you have it on a 2D screen, it's like a newsreader in your living room on your television. When the newsreader looks into the camera, everyone in the living room will think that the newsreader is looking at them. And that's an effect of 2D displays. If it looks to the side like this, nobody will think that it looks at them. So for a multi-party interaction, you want to be able to establish exclusive mutual gaze, to look at one person, as in the card game, saying, what do you think? And that's very hard to do with a virtual agent. Of course, you can infer, if it's like only two people, that it's looking there. You will not get a sense that the agent is looking at me if it looks to the side. But of course, you can sort of infer that it's probably looking at me. And so it's a very big difference in like how you perceive the interaction. If a robot looks you in the eyes, it feels like you really have a very special feeling of mutual gaze that you won't have with an avatar unless it looks at everyone. So that's actually a very interesting aspect there. I mean, and it's not just that, that's sort of a bit practical. Then there is this sense of presence that is very hard to, that has been shown in human robot interaction studies, for example. If you have I think it was just a very small robot looking like a bird, and it had an educational task teaching you to do something. And they compared having the physical robot with another virtual replica of it on a screen, and the subjects learned more when it was physical, which is a bit hard to understand why. But we can also sort of think intuitively, like meeting someone in person feels like a completely different thing from meeting them like this over camera. And if that difference is so big, we are willing to travel long distances and so on in order to have physical meetings, then there is something to a physical meeting. I think that is a little bit intangible, what that really is, beyond these more practical turn-taking aspects.
Okay, thanks.
Thank Agustin. Another question.
Yes, thank you. So hi, very nice talk, Gabriel. Thanks a lot. So you talked at the beginning about the uncanny valley. I wanted to know if you found any evidence of the existence of an uncanny valley along the turn-taking dimension. For example, if there's anything that you've tried that users may have found awkward.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, typically when you talk about uncanny valley, it's more like the appearance and looking like a zombie or these kind of aspects. I wouldn't use the term uncanny perhaps when it comes to the turn taking. But of course, if it's not done correctly, people will definitely very quickly sort of look. I think turn taking is one of the most basic fundamental aspects of communication that you just expect people to be able to manage on some kind of level. Having the robot suddenly interrupting you in the middle of a sentence is something that a human wouldn't do that way unless they really want to interrupt you. So that can really sort of put you off and sort of the whole illusion of having this conversation breaks down very quickly, I think, if you fail with the turn taking. But maybe not. I wouldn't call it uncanny, perhaps. But,
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I don't see other raised hands. Oh, Vladislav. So it's your turn.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I wanted to ask. So, with this sort of advancement in turn taking, supposed advancement with these models, what are new requirements in your opinion to dialogue management? Does it need to deal? I would guess that it will need to deal with more stuff with these turn taking models.
You mean what the dialogue manager has to consider when it comes to turn taking, or what?
Yes. Or I guess it will be more like incomplete inputs and stuff like that.
Yeah, I guess. I mean,
models.
Sometimes you split these things up and you sort of have some kind of interaction control module or something that handles the turn taking and says that, for example, if you're doing an end of turn prediction, you sort of look for these cues and so on until you have found this is a complete utterance, and then you can sort of hand that complete turn over to the dialogue manager. And if you fail with that, the dialogue manager will get half a turn and try to make the best of it, and it will fail, and there will be misunderstanding and so on. So that's one way. But as we talked a bit about before, also this seeing turn taking as this kind of first step, and then dialogue management after that is probably not ideal either, because in the turn taking you also want to consider whether what the system really wants to say. It depends on the interaction, of course, but so they should probably be more tightly integrated, I think. But at least you could have a module detecting these TRPs and saying here is a potential turn at least, and ask the dialogue manager, do you want to react to this or not?
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I don't see other hand raised, but I have a question. Well, I have several questions, but I have at least one. Yeah, I was wondering whether you think that turn taking can be optimized turn by turn, or do you think that maybe you can, by changing your way, if the machine changes its way to interrupt or to take the turn with the human, would that actually also change the behavior of the human and maybe make the interaction more effective if you actually try to influence the way the human, and then it would be a more long-term optimization than just local. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because I guess as humans, when we talk a lot with one person, we start to learn their behavior, and of course you would like the system to adapt to the user, but then eventually the user will start to adapt. So yeah, you would like to see some convergence there of this sort of co-adaptation. Yeah, I'm not sure. For this to happen, I guess you really need a model that is sort of learning all the time of the specific behavior of this user. That's also something we have started to look into, but like how can you have a more general turn-taking model and then look at the specific user and see if you can sort of predict this specific user's turn-taking patterns. And it will have an effect on the user. I guess that will just happen. People always adapt. So yeah.
Sure. Since I don't see other questions, I may have a last one maybe. Oh yeah, Maxine has a question. So Maxine, go for it.
Hi, so I'll join everybody in thanking you for a great talk with very interesting things to say. You talked about what would happen if you changed from one application to another. Can you address what would happen when you change from one language to another, which implies also from one culture to another? Do you have all of the detectors that you need to be able to deal with another language? Because we know that the data is going to be different. Or will you need other detectors? You've certainly worked on at least 2 languages a lot.
Yeah, we have mostly looked at, when it comes to turn taking, we have actually mostly looked at English, not so much Swedish. And one of the reasons is that we don't have that many spoken dialogue data sets for Swedish, unfortunately. But I'm sure there are certainly language and cultural differences that you would like to take into account. But it's not something that we have really looked into. I guess if you would just train the model on, I don't know, English map task and apply it to Swedish map task, it would be interesting to see what happened. I guess some of the prosodic things, since it's still like fairly close languages, like rising and falling pitch to some extent, I guess is similar. So yeah, there would be and the general pattern of how you have the conversation with the system is actually learning also that it sort of starts to understand that there is one person talking and then there's the other one maybe making an acknowledgement or a clarification request. So it's learning these patterns also. But in other types of conversation, I'm sure cultural differences make a very big difference in, for example, when you play the card game, in how you're having the discussion and so on.
But there's also a lot of barge in French, for example. If I talk to people in English the way I talk to people in French, everybody finds it's very impolite, but it's very natural in French because the cues are very different and one person is barging in with no time between utterances before another utterance is finished, for example. So there's a lot of interesting things to, even in different dialects in the same language.
Definitely. I mean, we have this idea of people in northern Sweden that have extremely long pauses between the turns. So yeah, I guess there are very big differences in general distributions of turn taking and so on that the system would have to understand. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for just one last question. Candace, you want to ask this question?
Hi, Gabriel. I really enjoyed your talk.
And in thinking about the models you developed, I was remembering a paper I read a long time ago about overlap speech that actually was a kind of coordination. In fact, the speakers kind of finished each other's utterances and all that sort of thing. It's really hard to come up with data that does that. It happened to be faculty members at American University. So it was English, but a very specific community. I wonder if you've thought about that at all, and also what the issue is about trying to come up with data sets for that.
For overlapping speech and how to, I think having there is a difference of sort of competitive overlap where you're sort of competing for the turn, and then what you describe, which is what described as collaborative overlap, where you are doing a lot of back channels or filling each other's turn in and so on, and helping each other out. And I think that would be the ultimate challenge for a dialogue system to do that, because then you really need prediction, right? So the other person is speaking and you have to continuously predict and then synchronize your speech with the other person, with the speech synthesis and everything. So of course that would probably be the ultimate challenge. I'm not sure. I mean, in many data sets, there is quite a lot of overlap, I guess. As we saw in this data we got from the museum here, we had at certain points a lot of overlap between the speakers also, which is of a more sort of helping each other out, cooperative type of overlap. It would be really interesting to model, but extremely challenging, I think, from a dialogue system perspective.
Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time, so I thank you, Gabriel, again. It was a great talk. Thank you for all the questions and the great answers. And let's go back to the live stream, I guess. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. I have a few things to mention. We're actually at a 30-minute break right now before we move on to the next session. I have to mention that while the Zoom meeting started, it froze on my computer. The live stream and the Zoom meeting froze, but thankfully it didn't break the live stream. It's still going. So that just means that I'm going to have to kind of reset everything. So keep your eye on Trello, especially on the conference day 1 schedule and live stream Trello card. That will have a new link to YouTube, Zoom meetings and stuff like that. I'll make sure all those are kept up to date. So anytime you're ready to join a live QA session, it's obviously correct. A couple of other things. We had closed captions on for the first session, at least for the opening remarks from Smara and Vivian. But we will not have closed captions for the rest of the conference because it overlaps with slides, and there's sometimes slides where authors are putting in captions for things that their systems are saying. So we won't use those. You can, of course, watch the YouTube videos on your own and turn on closed captions if you find something difficult to understand by listening to it. But that's it. We have about a little bit less than 30 minutes until the next session. So keep your eye on the conference day 1 Trello card. It will have a new link to YouTube in not too long. But thank you, Gabriel. Great talk. Gabriel, please look at the Keynote 1 Gabriel Scounted card. There's a lot of really nice questions in there that you weren't able to get to in the live QA. And thank you, Olivier, for chairing the session. See you all in a little bit.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Gabriel. Bye.